distributed last week. And so let's just very briefly recap what it is that I had covered. I actually started the session by giving you a sort of a very brief, almost telegraphic overview of the history of Muslim rule in Spain. Sort of, we covered the general historical background, and that sort of covered about the first 400 years of Muslim rule. In other words, the Muslims arrived in the year of about 711. And then I took you up to, we saw the period of the Caliphate in Cordoba, how that collapsed. And in the wake of the collapse of the Caliphate, that did not mean the end of Muslim rule. In fact, the glory days of Islam in Spain were far from over. And what actually happened in the aftermath of the collapse of the Caliphate was that we have Muslim Spain splitting up into individual kingdoms, or taifas, as I refer to them. And really, the heights, certainly from the Jewish point of view, the heights of the Golden Age, in fact, were much more in the period of the taifas rather than they were in the period of the Caliphate. But generally speaking, you know, when we talk about the Golden Age of Spanish Jewry, we are talking, you know, generally speaking, about the first, you know, 300 years, 200 to 300 years of Muslim rule in Spain. And what we saw last week is we looked at two figures in some detail, Khasta ibn Shaprut, who sort of was an exemplar of a Jew rising to the heights of great power in the caliphal court. And then in the period of the Taifa, or the Kingdom of Granada, we saw the figure of Samuel ibn Agrella and how he rose even to greater power, in fact, became the vizier, like the prime minister of the country. But we also saw at the same time that his son, Joseph Negrella, abused his position. He appointed, you know, cronies and Jewish cronies and friends to positions of power, you know, nepotism to say the least. And as a result of that, this was a sort of a case of Jews quite seriously overstepping their dhimmi status. And we saw a pogrom. Firstly, he was assassinated in Granada, and a pogrom broke out where almost the whole of the Jewish community of Granada was totally wiped out in the year of 1066. And that is one of the reasons why, when historians, you know, nobody sort of, there's very little disagreement about when the Golden Age began. You know, people will say, well, you know, certainly in the period of the Caliphate, it began, if not earlier. There is some debate about when it actually came to an end, but there are some historians who take the view that this Golden Age of Spanish Jewry comes to an end with the pogrom in Granada. Now, I think that's probably overstating the case a little bit, because Jewish life does continue in other parts of Spain. For example, the Taifa, or the Kingdom of Seville, still remains an important place, as does Cordoba, and there's still life that continues there. But nevertheless, we are not far off from that, from the end of that Golden Age. So what we then went on to do, after having a look at that general historical backdrop, we started to look at Jewish life under Muslim rule. And the focus was very much on trying to come to an understanding of what we mean by this so-called Golden Age. It's a term that's thrown around, and people refer to it, but what makes it a Golden Age? So we're going to pick up the notes this evening towards the bottom of page 8. This is part C, a synthesis between Jewish and Arabic culture. And the opening sentence is going to basically summarize what it is that made this so-called Golden Age golden, right? It's going to, a single sentence that will summarize that. Now, we looked at two of these elements last week, and tonight we are going to explore in some greater detail the third of those elements. Okay, so Rona, would you like to unmute for us and
Sure.
read those, you know, first few paragraphs that introduce this topic?
Sure. We have previously noted three features that define Spanish Jewry's Golden Age. Jews invested with significant political power from the Muslim authorities, their close involvement with Rabbinic Judaism, and their active engagement with the synthesis between Jewish and general Arabic culture. Regarding the latter, by the 10th century, for Jews in the Muslim world, pardon me, Arabic had replaced Aramaic as their spoken and written language. For the Jewish scholar and intellectual class, this opened the door to an emerging synthesis between Jewish and Islamic high culture, which saw Jews adopting Arabic science, medicine, and philosophy, about which they wrote in Arabic and Judeo-Arabic. For example, one can point to the impact of Arabic philosophers such as Al-Farabi, 9th to the 10th century in Baghdad, Ibn Sin or Avicenna, that's 10th to 11th century in Persia, the Sufi thinker Al-Ghazali, the 11th to 12th century in Persia, and Ibn Rushd or
Averroes, yeah.
12th century Cordoba, on the development of Jewish thought during the Middle Ages in Muslim Spain and beyond. In a similar vein, inspired by Arabic culture, and more particularly Arabic poetry, Jews of Muslim Spain produced what Raymond Scheindlin describes as the first secular Hebrew poetry since biblical times.
Okay, if you could just stop there for a minute, because what we're going to focus on is very much this, this development, really quite literally for the first time. For the first time, it was quite unique, of a sort of a poetry being written in Hebrew. Jews had written poetry before, but it was largely of a sort of a more liturgical character, right? And what we're going to see emerging in Spain is a distinctly secular poetry written in Hebrew, and it's going to be very much influenced by the Arabic tradition. The Arabs have developed this for a long period of time. But before we get there, I just want to make a few brief remarks about a whole other area of Jewish life, which was totally influenced by the Arabic world, by the Islamic world, and that is the development of Jewish philosophy. Because what we have to appreciate is that Jewish philosophy was not something that was indigenous to traditional Jewish life. There was a very, very important Jewish philosopher by the name of Philo, who lived in Alexandria, but he actually lived in the Hellenistic Greek-speaking world of the Jews. So he was very, very much influenced by Greek thinking and thought, and there was a whole Jewish community living in Alexandria that was thoroughly Jewish, but thoroughly Hellenized as well. So he, in many, many respects, was the first, what we might describe, the first systematic philosopher in that sort of Greek sense of the word. Now, he sort of disappears off the scene, mainly because after the destruction of the temple, the rabbinic tradition becomes the dominant force in Jewish life. All of those sects that existed during the period of the Second Temple, Pharisees, Sadducees, so on and so on and so on, they all disappeared. And the rabbinic tradition, who were Pharisees before the destruction of the temple, basically take control. And they did not look very kindly upon Hellenism or Hellenistic Judaism. And as a result, Philo, as a very, very important thinker, just basically gets lost to the Jewish world, and interestingly gets picked up in the Christian world. Philo actually becomes a very, very important influence in the development of early Christian theology and thinking. Now, from Philo, and if you want to sort of date Philo, he's sort of like around about the 1st century of the Common Era, roughly. You jump forward to our period, around about the period we're talking about, not even Muslim Spain, but Baghdad. Baghdad is where the Abbasid Caliphate had taken hold, and the Jewish community of Baghdad was very, very strongly influenced by Islamic culture as well. And the great philosopher that comes out of that world is a man called Saadia Gaon, and he's like the chief rabbi of the Baghdadian, or quote unquote Babylonian, because Jews still often refer to themselves as the community of Babel or Babylon. He was the chief rabbi, but he was also influenced by a particular school of Islamic philosophy that was very popular in Baghdad at the time. But then when you jump over to Spain, perhaps a few hundred years later or so, you start to see that the Jews in Spain are also influenced by the philosophical tradition that has taken root in Cordoba. And those names that were mentioned in the reading that Rona had done for us, it's interesting that Al-Farabi, Ibn Sin, and Al-Farabi and Ibn Sin, and Averroes in particular, Ibn Rushd, who notices Cordova. It's very interesting that when you read Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, this is Maimonides' great sort of magisterial work on Jewish philosophy. In the introduction, he actually pays homage to his Islamic teachers. In fact, he goes so far as to say is that once you get past the prophets of the Bible, there is no greater inspired thinker than Aristotle. And he basically buries all his contemporary Jewish thinkers. He said, they haven't got a clue what they're talking about, you know? And basically he really pays homage to Aristotle as a Greek thinker. The way the Jews came to Greek philosophy then was through the Greco-Arabic version of that philosophy. Because you've got to appreciate that, that Greek philosophy was essentially quite pagan. So when the Arabs, when the Muslims basically adopted it, they purified it in a certain sense. They put it through the strainer, if you want, of monotheism, and you came out with a sort of a slightly modified sort of product. And that is the philosophy that the Jews picked up. And of course, Maimonides, amongst others, developed a whole philosophical tradition that became a hallmark of Muslim Spain. Now, there's another thinker that Rona referred to, Al-Ghazali. And Al-Ghazali essentially is an important Sufi mystic. And mysticism, the school of mysticism developed by Al-Ghazali was an anti-philosophical school. So, and in fact, that whole trend of philosophy and anti-philosophy is something that characterizes the whole of the Middle Ages, not only in Islam, also in Judaism. So there were Jews who followed the Al-Ghazali, but also in Christianity. It's one of the big battlegrounds. Is philosophy or the mystical path the correct way to God? So that's very briefly. I mean, I could devote a whole session to dealing with Jewish philosophy, but we don't have the time to do that. But I just wanted to give you a sense that that's a whole important topic where we talk about the synthesis between Jewish and Islamic high culture, and that's in one particular area. What we're going to focus on tonight is the influence of Arabic language and poetry on a similar development in the Jewish world. So Rona, if you can just continue with the next paragraph.
In the Arabic-speaking Jewish society, the language of these poems was always Hebrew, yet the central role accorded to poetry did not stem originally from a Jewish impulse. Its history went back to the pre-literate life of the Arabian desert, whose Bedouin tribes had poured out of it in following the founding of Islam in the early 7th century and rapidly overrun much of the world under the new religion's martial banner. The cosmopolitan culture of the Islamic cities of the East, such as Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, with their class of professional poets supported by the patronage of royalty and wealth, was far removed from Bedouin life. Yet the special place of poetry persisted in Arab society and spread from the East to Andalusia. The annals of Muslim Spain are replete with stories that illustrate how readily men and women were moved to and swayed by poetic diction. Okay.
I mean, Hillel Halkin, who wrote a fantastic biography. This extract comes from his biography of Judah Halevi, who we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. In fact, I spoke about him last week. I think it's the Kuzari, didn't I? No, I didn't. No, don't worry about it.
Just, you did. You did.
I did. Oh, I did. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for being my reliable memory, Carmela. So thank you for that. So we spoke about Halevi, but so in his biography, he creates this beautiful portrait of what life was like in what you would describe living in a poetic age. And this was not merely an age in which people loved poetry and wrote poetry, but they conducted their whole discourse in poetic form. So if you invited someone to a garden party, you would send out a poem, and often you would get often you would get a poet to compose a poet especially for that invitation. Sorry about this, hang on. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of a class, Beck. I'll call you later.
Oh, where's Ma?
She's out, okay?
Okay, bye.
Bye. Sorry about that. Okay, all right. So, and you would respond in poetic verse as well. At these garden parties, there were like poetry competitions. People would compose poems, original poems to be recited at these gardens. They were more like wine parties rather than garden parties. They were wine parties held in gardens and so on and so on. So this was really, poetry was a very, very sort of, it was a hallmark of cultured life in the upper echelons of Arabic, certainly Arabic society. So you've got to understand that this poetry was taken very, very seriously, and it was part of one's classical education, not only in the Arabic world, but if you were a Jewish child from the upper classes, influenced by this Arabic tradition, you would study Arabic, you would study Arabic poetry and all of the mechanisms in that. So this stuff was taken very seriously. Moshe, did you have your hand up? Yeah, you want to unmute and just share with us. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask about the influence over Islamic philosophy of things further east, such as India.
Well, it's not so much that the influence is more Persia. And one of the things that we know about Alexander the Great, as we know, he conquered most of the known ancient Near Eastern world. And interestingly, even though he was born in Macedonia, and he considered himself culturally, at least, a Greek in every sense of the word, he did not spend the greater part of his life in that part of the world, but actually he made his base in Persia. So Persia became a very, very important center of Hellenism. And if you think about the Arabic world in the East, that was very strongly influenced by those traditions. So that's where that sort of thing came from. Okay. Now there were contacts with the East, you know, through the Silk Road and other things. There were contacts, but that influence was much more the Hellenistic Persian influence that was in play there. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to read some of this poetry. We're going to read it in English. And therein lies the problem, because to really, really appreciate the beauty of it and the power of it, you've got to go into the original Hebrew. But if I do that with most of you, it's going to be all Greek to you, right? So there's not a lot of point in that. But for those of you who do have access to the Hebrew, many, many years ago, I think it was Penguin, put out a thing called the Oxford Book of Hebrew Verse or something. It's a big, thick volume going to, I don't know, 700, 800, 900 pages. And it's actually a bilingual edition of Jewish poetry written over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And there is a whole section on the poetry written by the Jews of Spain. So that's where you sort of get the entree to the Hebrew. So it's going to lose a lot in the translation, but we're not going to be so interested in the language, but more in the themes. And the themes don't get lost here. Now, before we start reading this poetry, a few important observations. The poetry deals with the Arabic poetry, which the Jews inherit from the Arabs, deal with two major topics. One is wine poetry, and the other is love poetry. And you're probably thinking, wait a minute, if we're talking Arabs and Muslims, what are they doing writing and glorifying wine and shikering and the whole thing and so on and so on? Well, you know, there's a saying that I often have, you know, it's people, there's a law for the machas and there's a law for the kakas, right? So the everyday, the hoi polloi in Islamic society adhered strictly to the rules on the ground, but the upper classes behind their beautiful high walls in the villas did whatever they did. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they actually imbibed in the forbidden drink and so on and so on. And not only that, we also have strong evidence to suggest that in that Islamic world, there was a very, very strong sort of a homoerotic tradition as well. All right. So a lot of the forbidden pleasures was certainly very, very much of that upper class of society. And that's why the love poetry occupies such an important place as well. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Secondly, when you read this poetry, I'm talking particularly Hebrew, the Hebrew poetry, it is distinctly, there are many elements of it, particularly the love poetry, which is distinctly erotic. And I emphasize erotic and not pornographic. The difference basically is that when it's pornographic, it's explicit. When it's erotic, it's suggestive, it's euphemistic, right? It's teasing you. It's not like flashing it right in front of your eyes and face. So what you have to be very aware of is that when you read this poetry, there are certain euphemisms. So when, for example, the poet writing a poetry addressed to his young female lover, he will talk about knocking on her door. And I can assure you, he's not talking about visiting her on a Sunday afternoon with a bunch of flowers, but he's knocking on her door, if you get my drift. Or when he talks about in the poem, as one of the things we're going to read tonight, he talks about, and my hand was grazing in her garden. He wasn't picking flowers. He was busy doing something else, right? So this is sort of the suggestive language that you get in this poetry. And by the way, a lot of it comes out of the biblical Song of Songs. Song of Songs, which is a highly, highly erotic poem, has precisely a lot of that language, a lot of that imagery that you find in the poetry of Muslim Spain comes out of there. So there's two influences going on. There's the influence of the Arabic world and the sort of poetry that they were writing, and the forms and so on, but also there is the influence of biblical poetry, particularly as you find it in the Song of Songs, right? Those are the two things. The other thing finally is this. One of the euphemisms is that often you will find that the object of love interest, where it's a young woman, is referred to as a doe or as a fawn, one of the others, whatever it is. And if the object of love interest is a young man, homoerotic type of poetry, it's a fawn, right? So there's a doe and a fawn. So they're talking about so with that in mind, I'm going to take you through some of this poetry, and then we're going to sort of discuss it further and analyze it. So let's begin with the wine poetry. And the poet here writes, "Red to the eye, sweet to the drinker. It is poured out in Spain, but its bouquet reaches India." There you go. Somebody, Moshe, you asked about India before, so clearly it's acknowledged here. "When it is in the bowls, it is feeble, but once it goes to the head, it holds sway over swaying heads. The wretch whose heart's blood is mixed with his tears banishes his sorrows with the grape's blood. And as the goblets make the rounds, passing from hand to hand, it seems as if the friends are casting lots for a diamond." And then we have this wine song written in honor of spring, the spring season. "The cold season has slipped away like a shadow. Its rains are already gone, its chariots and its horsemen. Now the sun, in its ordained circuit, is at the sign of the ram, like a king reclining on his couch. The hills have put on turbans of flowers, and the plain has robed itself in tunics of grass and herbs. It greets our nostrils with the incense hidden in its bosom all winter long. Give me the cup that will enthrone my joy and banish sorrow from my heart. The wine is hot with anger. Temper its fierce fire with my tears. Beware of fortune. Her favors are like the venom of serpents spiced with honey. But let your soul deceive itself and accept her goodness in the morning, even though you know that she will be treacherous at night. Drink all day long until the day wanes and the sun coats its silver with gold, and all night long until the night flees like a Moor while the hand of dawn grips its heel." So here you get a little taste of that sort of wine poetry. And really, if you think about it, the type of lifestyle that it's describing is thoroughly hedonistic. I mean, we're talking about the poet glorifying the idea of shikering 24 hours a day. It's not enough that you drink all day, but you drink through the night as well, right? So you get this sort of image of a totally, thoroughly hedonistic, pleasure-seeking type of life. But accompanying that drinking life is also the love poetry as well. And we're going to look at some of that now. So the poet writes here a poem entitled Your Rightful Portion, and he writes, and he says, caress the breasts of the lovely girl at night and kiss the lips of the beautiful girl all day long. Spurn those who chide you for loving, who counsel you to their own advantage, and heed my words of truth. There is no life but in the company of beauty's daughters, who stole out of Eden to torture the living, and there is no man living who is not full of desire. Plunge your heart into pleasures, make merry, drink out of wineskins by the riverside to the sound of lyres, doves and swifts. Dance and rejoice, clap your hands, get drunk, and knock on the door of that lovely girl. These are the delights of the world. Take your part, as did the priests from the ram of installation. Always allot yourself the very portion that was your leader's due. Do not stop sipping the moist lips until you hold your rightful portion, the breast and the thigh. And then we have a poem, a short poem, which glorifies the apple. But it's not a mere apple, because the poet writes and says, you have captured me with your charm, my lady. You have enslaved me brutally in your prison. From the very day that we had to part, I have found no likeness to your beauty. I console myself with a rosy apple whose scent is like the myrrh of your nose and your lips, its shape like your breast, and its color like the hue which is seen on your cheek. I mean, when I first read this poem, after that, the apple was never again the same to me, right? I never thought of an apple in precisely the same way. There was something distinctly erotic about taking hold of and, biting into an apple after you read a poem like this. And then you have the sensitive doe, and the object of love interest is a young woman. And the poet writes and says, "O graceful doe, pity this heart in which you have dwelt all your life. Know that the day you leave me, your going will be my ruin. And even now, when my eyes dare to glance at your splendor, I am stung by the serpents that guard your cheeks, for their poison burns like fire, and they drive me out. She ensnared my heart with the breasts that lie upon her heart, a heart of stone, and yet it put forth two apples." Here we go again with the apples. "They stand guard, one to the left and one to the right, like breasts, like lances. Their fiery nipples burn in my heart, though they never come near me. Their mouths have drunk my blood, they felt no shame at all. This doe violates the laws of God with her eyes. She kills me with malice aforethought, yet no one avenges me. Have you ever seen the heart of a lion joined to the eyelids of a gazelle? Her eyelids have learned to tear like a lion. They hurl sharpened arrows at me. They drain my heart's blood to the dregs. They are out for my life." Now, one day when I was reeling like a drunkard, longing for the wine of her love, she dispatched envoys to me, bearing greetings and complaints. And when they returned to her, she begged them, "O messengers of peace, come again and yet again." So these tidings seduced my heart and they revived my spirit. But one day, when my hands were grazing in her garden and fondling her breasts, she said, "Now take away your hands, they are not skillful enough." And her words were so seductive that they melted my heart. "Do not touch me, friend. I do not like those who hurt me. My breasts are soft and sensitive. Enough. I shall refuse one and all." Now, you've got to remember, folks, this is sort of like medieval period in a sort of quite intensely Jewish community. We're talking fairly raunchy type of poetry. But one of the interesting things about this poem, and a lot of this love poetry is of that type, it's a sort of an unrequited love, right? The poet yearns, but he can never get really to that ultimate sort of point of fulfillment, and so on and so on. So this is part of the thing. Notice, of course, accompanying this whole lovemaking, so to speak, is the drinking as well. So the wine and the love comes together in this particular poetry. And finally, before we get to some liturgical poetry, a couple of examples, I want to read a poem about the treacherous fawn. And remember, that the faun, the object of love interest here, is a young, probably adolescent boy. We're probably talking about, 13, 14, something like that, as would have been probably the case in of the young woman as well. And the poet writes this. So here we're getting into homoerotic territory, and he writes, "My heart's desire and my eye's delight, the heart beside me and a cup in my right hand. Now many denounce me for loving, but I pay no heed. Come to me, faun, and I shall vanquish them. Time will consume them and death will shepherd them away. Oh, come to me, faun, let me feast on the nectar of your lips until I am satisfied. But why? Why should they discourage me? If there be any sin or guilt in being ravished by your beauty, let the Lord be my judge. Do not let your heart be swayed by the words of my tormentor, that obstinate man. Oh, come, put me to the test." So he was lured, and we went to his mother's house, and there he bent his back to my heavy yoke. Night and day I alone was with him. I took off his clothes and he took off mine. I sucked at his lips and he suckled me. But once his eyes had done away with my heart, his hand fastened the yoke of my sin, and he looked for grievances against me. He raged and shouted in fury, "Enough, leave me alone. Do not drive me to crime. Do not lead me astray." Oh, do not be unrelenting in your anger, faun. Show me the wonders of your love, my friend. Kiss your friend and fulfill his desire. And if you wish to let me live, give me life. But if you would kill, then kill me. So reactions. What are you thinking here? What are you feeling about this stuff? What are your thoughts? Rona.
Well, two things I thought of. First of all, where are the female poets?
Right.
Why? Right. And the second one is, were these compiled in books of poetry? How were they? How did they get around the community?
Well, one of the things. Well, I'll make the observation now because I'm not sure if it comes up in the notes that follow, the commentary that follows. But one of the things we have to appreciate is that very, very wealthy in the Muslim world and in the Jewish world, wealthy individuals were great patrons of poets. So patronage was a big thing, and often they would get these poets to write poetry specifically for the wine parties. So this was poetry that was not just written and put on sort of the Amazon bestseller list, so to speak. This poetry was written to be recited, right? Remember, we're living in a poetic age. So it had a sort of a real life to it, and so on and so on. The poetry survived. I mean, we have it. It's obviously would have written in manuscript form. I don't have enough knowledge about the provenance of the poetry, how it survived and how it got passed on, but certainly that is the context in which that poetry was written. So it was written for live audiences. It was recited in this sort of type of environment. Anyone else? Yes, Carmela.
It's really interesting what you say, that the poetry was written to be recited. So it's almost as though it was the effect of reciting it on the one who's reading it and on those who are listening to it.
Yeah.
Than the actual sexual act itself. I mean, we don't, presumably a lot went on, but we don't know exactly what went on.
Okay.
And what's being written here is unrequited, as you say, because in the end, the one that's being seduced is saying that's enough. I mean, they put a limit there.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting what you say, that it's the most important thing is in the reciting and stirring everyone up.
Yeah, yeah, and by the way, in the recital, in an environment which would have, wine drinking, and it would have been a quite sort of lustful type of environment where this poetry was recited. You can imagine almost with the poet saying, and his hands were grazing a garden, these drunk men snickering along as they sort of, ha 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 ha, listen to that, etc. type of thing. So yeah, it was very much in the reciting, as you say, and in the reception of that reciting that was very important. Now, the question that you raise is an interesting one. We're going to come to it a little bit later. Doesn't necessarily mean that just because people were writing about this homoeroticism and all this stuff and all this drinking, that it was necessarily going on. There is the leading scholar of Hebrew poetry in the medieval Spain is a man by the name of Raymond Scheindler. I'm going to refer to him in the notes a little bit later on. So I've relied very heavily on his scholarship. He's like a, you know, he's mastered this stuff. And according to him, there is considerable evidence that the sort of the homoeroticism that we read of in the poetry was also present in the upper reaches of the Islamic society as well, right? Now that's interesting, of course, because if you think about the dual ban on alcohol and certainly the homosexual act, I mean, they're two absolute no-nos. It's interesting that I read a number of years ago a sort of a thought that in a society, we're talking about an Islamic society, where women were kept in the home. Unlike Christian society, women occupied the public space. In Islamic society, that was not the case, right? And the suggestion is that with the absence of women in the public space, it may have created an environment which lent itself to, at the very least, sort of homoerotic fantasies, if not realities. So you're not sure. So Scheindler seems to be quite convinced that some of this stuff that you read in the poetry was actually a reflection of real life. Now, whether the same can be said of Jewish society, we're going to come to that question a little bit later on, because these are Jews writing about this stuff. So God forbid, you're telling me they're not just shikering, but they're also at it with young adolescent boys as well. And what about Leviticus, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a subject of historical debate. We're going to get to that a little bit later. Okay, yes.
Paul, this sort of reminds me very much of Chaucer.
Well, if you want to, yeah.
Similar timing and
yeah, there is a bawdiness. I mean, in a certain sense, I think Chaucer's poetry is more bawdy, right? I think there's an eroticism here that I don't necessarily pick up in the same way with Chaucer. I think Chaucer has a bawdiness about his poetry that I don't see reflected here. So it's sort of different. I mean, it's written for a very specific context.
Well, it wasn't written as performance poetry. Or...
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think these people in the Middle Ages were writing poetry which are going to stick in some bookstore. I mean, clearly it was written to be performed, right? That's the whole thing.
But,
yeah.
But is the timing sort of similar to?
No. We're way centuries and centuries apart.
Yeah, that's what
I think.
If you're asking me whether Chaucer was influenced by these Jewish and Islamic poets, I don't know. Imagine if you want. I doubt it very much. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I just think it's a bunch of guys just showing off. I mean, they write poetry, but they're just getting together with wine and showing off, you know. Right. Level and the next level.
Okay, I can see you've been influenced by the march yesterday. Your reaction to this poetry was influenced.
It really doesn't.
Yeah. By the way, Rona's point about the absence of women poets, you're absolutely right. They're not entirely absent. They are there. Last week I spoke about a foundational poet in Muslim Spain called Dunash ibn Labrat, Khasta ibn Shaprut, who was like a foreign minister in the court of the Caliph. He was a great patron. And he actually brought Dunash ibn Labrat over from North Africa to Cordoba, and he starts this whole tradition of Hebrew poetry. Now, interestingly, Dunash ibn Labrat, his wife, was a poet of some note as well, right? But as far as I know, she wasn't writing the sort of stuff we're reading about tonight. It was a different sort of order, which is why I haven't included her, because I just wanted to get into the shikering and into the homoeroticism tonight, you know. Stephen, go ahead.
I just think that Chaucer may have been more influenced by the Italian poets, like
there's no problem
and all that.
Yeah. And look, by the way, there's some evidence to suggest that when we look at Italian writing, there was a distinct influence coming from Spain as well. Spanish tradition. Certainly, we have a very important poet in Italy called Emmanuel of Rome, who writes some of the. I mean, Emmanuel of Rome is much more like Chaucer. He writes stuff that's not erotic, but like really seriously bawdy. it's like, it's embarrassing. Some of the stuff is like embarrassing, right? If I read it in a class, I go a little bit pink, not quite red. It's really quite embarrassing. And he was very strongly influenced by Spanish traditions of poetic writing. So I think there's something to be said for that. Okay, any other points before we move on? So we're going to sort of shift gear, and we're going to look at something that is distinctly spiritual and religious. We're going to read some liturgical poetry. So this is from the introduction to the Ne'ilah, which is the closing prayer of Yom Kippur, and this is the introduction to the Ne'ilah that some of you might remember or recognize.
Yeah.
And it's awe-inspiring creator God, awe-inspiring creator God, forgive us for forgiveness for our sins in this closing hour, b'sha'at ha-ne'ilah.
Yeah.
That's why I put in the Hebrew, because it might be familiar.
Yeah.
We who are called few in number, raise our eyes towards you and tremblingly beseech you in this closing hour, as we pour out our souls, wipe away our sins and denials, craft forgiveness for us in this closing hour, be our protector, shield us from terror, seal our fate for joy and glory in this closing hour. Be compassionate and loving towards us, bring judgment on all who would oppress or war against us in this closing hour, and so on and so on. And if we jump a couple of stanzas, we come to a second poem, The Servant of God, which is a hymn for Yom Kippur that certainly you will find in the Sephardic Machzorim, but I'm not sure whether they appear in the Ashkenazic one. And the poet here writes, "Oh, would that I might be a servant unto thee, thou God by all adored. Then though my friends outcast, thy hand would hold me fast and draw me near to thee, my King and Lord. Spirit and flesh are thine, O heavenly shepherd mine, my hopes, my thoughts, my fears, thou seest all. Thou measurest my path, my steps dost know. When thou upholdest, who can make me fall? When thou restrainest, who can bid me go? O would that I might be a servant unto thee, thou God by all adored," and so on and so on and so on. So that gives you a little bit of a taste. That gives you a little bit of a taste of the poetry. And what we're now going to do is get into a little bit of a discussion, because it's one thing to read it, but I want to do a little bit of critical analysis to sort of, get into sort of more scholarly discussions of this particular poetry. And as I said, one of my primary points of reference for this material, not the only one, but primary one, is Raymond Shindley, who I reference in these particular notes. So the first thing I want to pick up here is this theme of Jews actually appropriating the whole linguistic and poetic tradition from the Arabic world, because it's very important to understand that that is where essentially they got it from. So Stephen, do you want to unmute for us and take us through that particular section?
Okay, among the Muslim aristocracy, literature and especially poetry were highly regarded. Grammar, lexicography, and rhetoric formed the basis of a classical Muslim education, strongly influenced by Arabic linguistic, literary, and cultural traditions. Jews devoted themselves to an intensive study of Arabic language and literary models, which in turn motivated them to revisit the Bible and study Hebrew in a new scientific spirit, adopting techniques and concepts which they learned from Arabic linguists and grammarians. Jews began systematically to analyze the language of the Hebrew Bible. Taking their lead from Arabic poets, Jews too composed a large body of secular poetry. However, rather than use Arabic, these poets employed Biblical Hebrew as their language of expression and produced texts which reflected the refined literary style of the Bible, whilst imitating the patterns of sound, rhythm, and meter used in Arabic poetry. Though their use of Hebrew, not merely as the traditional language of prayer and study, but as a vehicle of secular creative expression, the Jewish poets of Spain invested the language of the Bible with a new status as a cultural monument. However, these poets did more than simply emulate the linguistic styles and forms of their Muslim counterparts. The secular Hebrew poetry of Muslim Spain also imitated the content and themes of the Arabic literary tradition, amongst others, love and wine.
Okay, so one important point that needs to be added to what Stephen has written, they wrote this in Hebrew, and especially the Hebrew of the Bible, and especially influenced by the Hebrew of Song of Songs. Because when you read this particular poetry in Hebrew, you get a sense, there are echoes of that going back to this biblical thing. Now, it's interesting they chose to write it in Hebrew, and biblical Hebrew, which was in a certain sense a dead language, in the sense that it was not used as a sort of form of everyday type of communication and expression. It was the holy tongue. So why didn't they just say, we love this Arabic poetry, so we're just going to do what the Arabs do and write in Hebrew? Raymond Scheindlin and others, a number of others, make the point that what they were also doing was in competition with the Arabic world. Because for the Arabs, Arabic was not simply an everyday language, it was the language of the Quran. It was the most beautiful language in the world. And the way in which they could express that was through writing this poetry, not only religious poetry, but secular poetry as well. And in a certain sense, what Jews thought they wanted to do here is get into competition and say, you think your language is the most beautiful in the world. You have not heard anything yet. Wait till we show you the beautiful Song of Songs. And they sort of emulate that. So there's almost, many historians argue, a sort of a competition between a cultural competition, competitors if you want, between the Jewish and the Arabic poets as well. So this is sort of the argument of what's going on here. Yeah, Moshe.
Just a question about what period of time are we talking about when this was happening?
Okay, so we're talking about the period of the Caliphate in Cordoba, which begins around about 900 and continues into the Taifa kingdom period of Granada. So we're talking probably 900 till about 1150 or 1100, something like that. Talking a period of around about 200 years.
Okay, so in this regard, the sort of work of the folks that were actually getting the tropes done in Torah and the biblical language, all of that stuff was getting completely codified, and then Rashi was actually starting to try to explain all the words and what they meant. It's a little bit later than what you're talking about, but something about the biblical Hebrew starting to be studied and sort of explained a bit better. Does that have anything to do with this?
Yeah, absolutely. And what you have to understand is that Spain is the home of Hebrew grammar. Up until this point, there was no formal grammatical system in the sense that we have rules for grammar, right? You can induce those rules from reading the Bible, but there's no handbook. And Spanish Jews were the first ones to write the handbook. And that was influenced by the fact that Arabs were supreme linguists. They had such great pride in their language that they developed a sort of in a stylistic, and that's where, and they said, if we're going to sort of develop this, we've got to go back to the original, back to the language of the Hebrew Bible. So some of the great grammarians, for example, Dunash ben Labrat, who I spoke about earlier, was not only a great poet, but a great grammarian as well. And he influenced the whole school of things. I mean, I went to Mount Scopus, for example, and we had a teacher by the name of Dr. Ronda, and he was like the master of Hebrew grammar, Dick Duke, as it's called. He was called Dr. Ronda. We often refer to him as Dr. Dick Duke. That guy, I got to tell you, he taught me for 2 years. And I left Mount Scopus because I continued to study classical Hebrew at university. I had such a thorough grounding in grammar because of this guy, but I have basically these damn Spanish poets to thank for that rather than him. It all goes back to them, right? That's the thing. Any other? Yes, Rona and then David. Yeah.
Yeah. poor Dr. Rhonda taught me for about 4, 5, 6 years, and I'm afraid he didn't have the same effect on me as he had on you. I can't remember much at all.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I was under the desk reading the erotic Spanish poetry as well. You see, yeah. Anyway, all right, David.
If there was a competition between Hebrew and Arabic, does this mean that the Arabs could speak Hebrew?
No. It was about linguistic pride. It was not like they mounted communal competitions where they could. We're talking about a linguistic pride, and the Jews saying we can do as well, if not better than you. Right? It was a case of putting it up them. That's the point that I'm sort of making. Okay, let's move on to the next point, and a little bit about the environment, because Carmela made the very important point before. She elaborated on it quite nicely about the notion that this poetry was to be recited. It wasn't just written for the sake of being written. So we have to have some sort of an understanding, an appreciation of what was the environment like in which this poetry was actually recited. And Raymond Scheindlin, in his book, and what I've taken out here is just a couple of heavily edited extracts, gives us this wonderfully evocative description of what a wine party was like. These wine parties are like where the poetry was recited. So Carmela, since you started the recitation thing, why don't you give us a description of the context in which this poetry reading occurred?
From within the Jewish literary tradition, the Jews of Muslim Spain were the first to write secular wine poetry, which they adopted from their Muslim contemporaries. However, this poetry was not written simply to be enjoyed at one's own leisure. Rather, as Raymond Scheindlin, a leading scholar of Spanish medieval Hebrew poetry, writes, Hebrew poetry about wine presupposes a communal situation in which wine is drunk, the wine party, wine, women and death, medieval Hebrew poems on the good life.
Yeah, so that's the book that he writes. Now, wine and women I can understand. Why death? Is wine the source of your death, or is the women the source of your death? I have no idea, but that's the title of the book. So going on.
He notes that there are many sources that describe, surprisingly, the wine drinking practices of the upper classes of Muslim Spain, and assumes that these also applied to their Jewish counterparts. The Andalusian gardens of southern Spain, with their patios and fountains, were the settings for wine and poetry soirees, which Scheindlin describes in rich detail. The wine, usually mixed with water, was introduced after dinner, and the drinkers sat on cushions alongside small tables. A specially trained wine pourer, the saki, was usually a young boy who carried out his task with flirtatious charm. At times this was done by young girls in short hair and dressed like boys. The revelers passed the night drinking, nodding, waking, and drinking again. They were entertained not only by dancers and singers, but also by reciting and discussing each other's poetry, including wine poems written especially for the occasion. In imitation of the Arabic, Hebrew wine poems included descriptions of the garden setting, the group of drinkers, the time of drinking, the wine itself, the music entertainers, and erotically charged imagery of the saki, the person serving the wine.
Now, can you imagine this highly charged, sexualized environment? You know, like you've got what is an adolescent boy, essentially, right? We're talking someone who is sort of just out of puberty, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And the way Scheindlin describes it, the eyes of this saki were also made up, right? And so on and so on. And these guys are sitting around drinking, and this poetry is being recited. So you can imagine the highly charged, sexualized sort of environment in which the sort of poetry was actually being read, right? So it's quite. I mean, as I said in the note, surprisingly, we read about this sort of stuff. Now, it raises the interesting question. Which I think Carmela pointed us to a little earlier on. So if we're saying, okay, if Scheindlin is saying the evidence would seem to suggest that this was actually not just in the poets' minds, but was actually sort of going on in real sort of wine parties. You know, even if we're not talking about homosexuality being practiced, but certainly a strongly homoerotic environment where this sort of stuff is going on. The interesting question goes on is, if Hebrew poets, Jewish poets, are writing this about in Hebrew, does it therefore mean that, can we conclude that they were just writing about this stuff, or were they actually involved in this type of lifestyle as well? We're talking obviously about the upper classes, and it's a subject of some debate. This is what we call a sort of a historiographical debate as to whether, what can you read into this? Were Jews doing this stuff, or were they just writing about it? So let's have a look at this. Moshe, do you want to unmute for us and read that section about Hebrew wine and love poetry? The question here, was it a question of art imitating life?
Scholarly discussions of the Hebrew poetry of Muslim have addressed the question of whether the subjects of these secular poems are totally contrived, or whether they bore some relation to social reality. For many years, Chaim Sherman was the reigning scholarly voice regarding this poetry. Writing in the 1950s, he argued that these poems were stylistic works written by Jewish poets simply to challenge the hegemony of Arabic poems at the time. They were purely creative attempts to prove the strength and flexibility of Hebrew as a language. A more recent scholar of the Jewish medieval period, Howard Zvi Edelman, tends to agree. He writes that it is important not to fall into the trap of viewing the motifs of these poems as accurate reflections of Jewish life in Spain. Rather, they are accurate reflections of the kinds of images that Jews borrowed from the poetry of the Arabs. That's from his book. However, other scholars, for example, Norman Roth, Hillel Halkin, Norman Stillman, tend towards a view articulated by Raymond Chandlin. Regarding the wine poetry, he argues that it is futile to argue that the language and style of the poetry and the reality they describe are merely a literary fashion copied from Arabic poetry, and that therefore they do not necessarily reflect the experience of the poets. While somewhat more tentative, he reaches a similar conclusion about the Hebrew love poetry of this period. A particularly interesting participant in this discussion is Stephen Greenberg, the first openly gay Orthodox rabbi. In Wrestling with God and Men, he draws on this poetry as part of a wider discussion about reconciling homosexuality with Jewish tradition.
So that's interesting. And Stephen Greenberg, by the way, came out here to Melbourne a number of years ago. I think he was brought out by Caulfield Shul, if I'm not mistaken. That certainly would have put Rabbi Genendi well in the favors of his board. So they would have been happy campers, no doubt, about that. But nevertheless, his book is fascinating. And the section where he writes about the poetry of Spain, I mean, it's quite tendentious, because he writes about that poetry in order to demonstrate the argument that, you know, if it was good enough for these Jews living in the medieval world of Spain, it's good enough for us. That's sort of the line. He's trying to sort of demonstrate that, you know, when we try to convince ourselves that about the absence of a homoerotic tradition in Judaism, that's just certainly not the case. And so he draws, amongst many, many other things, on the poetry of Muslim Spain. So his book is written with a far more tendentious type of purpose in mind than scholars like Scheindlin and so on and so on. That's why I sort of put him aside, because you've got to take him a little bit with a grain of salt, but nevertheless, he is supported by other serious scholars. So before we go on to the final point of discussion about this poetry, does anyone have any other thoughts or questions about this? Carmela?
Yes, look, I might have really missed the point in this question, but in the poetry readings, are Jews and Arabs sitting together? Are the Jews and Muslims sitting together, or are the Jews reciting their poetry to Jews and the Arabs and the Muslims to Muslims?
Right, there's some mixed views on this, and the argument, look, the argument sort of goes that, you know, when we talk about a golden age, we've got to be very, very careful of not sliding into that slippery slope of thinking that sort of every single Jew walking around in the streets of Cordoba had this wonderful golden age. We're talking here about a golden age of the elite. It's really important to emphasize that. The intellectual, upper, wealthy classes. So there was a meeting of minds. There's no question that Muslims and Jews were in conversation with each other, right? They weren't just reading each other's stuff and whatever have you. And Scheindlin and other scholars are of the view that a lot of these wine parties would have been joint efforts and joint affairs as well. I mean, there's every reason, you know, we don't actually have it in the Arabic world, but there's no reason to believe that Arabic poets might not have commissioned Jewish poets to write poetry for them as well. They may have. I mean, they had plenty of their own to do it, so it was not necessarily a need. But there's certainly, one could well imagine that this may very well have been the case. In fact, there is a wonderful text that is written by a halachic authority living in Baghdad. And he says, I have been asked a question. I've been asked the question, whether it's permissible for Jews to join Muslims in the drinking of wine, right? And in particular, it seems to be in more festive type of environments. So firstly, the question seems to presuppose that it was going on. So he has this wonderful answer. God bless them, the rabbis, the way they get out of this, you got to be a genius. He says, look, firstly, let's understand that the Jews we're talking about are not everyday Jews. They were often high officials. They were, you know, active in the caliphal courts, etc., etc. So firstly, to refuse would be like a slap in the face. So you can't do it. Jews could be hurt by refusing. However, when you're there and when you're drinking, as long as while you are drinking, you don't enjoy yourself, but think about the destroyed temple in Jerusalem, the dust of the shrine, how abject you are. As long as you are drinking and you're thinking about that, it's okay, right? That's the answer, right? So, I mean, it's a wonderful teshuvah because rabbinic ingenuity in dealing with real life questions and problems just, it takes it completely out of you. But in answer to your question, it presupposes that Jews on a social level were interacting with Muslims and particularly in the upper classes of society. So I think that's what that would suggest. I mean, a teshuvah is only written because it's a real life question. Rabbis didn't sort of make up these scenarios as some sort of imaginary question. So clearly a question was addressed to him, right? So as long as you think about the ruined shrine in Jerusalem, it's fine. Yeah, okay, Stephen.
Omar Khayyam's book is very much about wine drinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think they tried to get rid of his book, the Imams, but I don't think they were successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean that whole tradition, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and other long epic poems that go back into the Middle Eastern world, were very much the inspiration of a lot of this sort of stuff. By the way, a lot of people write about the fact, we talked about this originating in the Bedouin deserts, this poetry. I mean, you got to remember, these were illiterates. And you read a lot of people, people describing the ability of these Bedouin Arabs to simply extemporize, to just get up. They couldn't write and just just go for it. And I emphasize that point because in pre-Islamic Arabia, it was pagan. And the one thing that unified the Arabic world was language. They had this incredible pride in their language. And that sort of passes on into Islam. And because the Arabs had such pride in their language, the Jews in Cordoba saying, you know what, this beautiful language of yours, we can match that. So that's the sort of the type of competitiveness that's going on. Ruth, yes, do you want to unmute and go for it? Yeah, okay.
There seems to be three different things going on here, the pride in the language, religion, and this very crude kind of understanding. I actually don't find this eroticism so surprising. if you've got a society which, you know, you've got all these groups of men and women aren't allowed, you see the same thing today. You know, the men get together and they have their little crew.
Yeah, the boys night out. You
boys
know,
boys being boys. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
like I don't find it so surprising at all.
So what Carmela read about is sort of like the Cordovan equivalent of a pub, you know.
Yeah.
But much more exotic and erotic, one would say, you know. Yeah.
What I find more interesting is the way in which the Jews, in fact, had this parallel life, which is what we remember of the Golden Age, where they turned to mysticism and to religion, where the these kind of conversations with men were actually turned to something quite else.
Yeah,
and I think it's probably what we remember rather than these crude little men's clubs that are not so surprising.
All right. Okay. I mean, there is certainly a take on this poetry. I mean, that's a nice critical analysis. Crude little men's clubs, but that's an interesting way of putting it. Okay. Any other thoughts? So I've got a question for you folks. We read a lot of poetry, wine poetry, love poetry, and then I read some sort of selections from the liturgical poetry. I want you to think about this for the moment. I want you in your mind for a moment to create a profile, if you want, of the poets who are writing the love and wine poetry, and a profile of the poets who are writing the liturgical poetry. What sort of people were they? Anyone want to have a bit of a shot? What sort of people were they? Yeah, just have a think. There's no right or wrong answer. Yeah, anyone? Yeah, Deborah.
Okay, well, I think the poets of the wine and the erotic ones were those who frequented those parties, and the liturgical poets are those who were part of the schools.
Okay, all right.
Like the yeshivot.
Okay, yeshivot. Okay, yeah. Serge?
Possibility.
They were one and the same.
Yeah, how do you know that?
Well, they were both writing. If you look at the language is both flowery in both ways. They were one and the same. The ones writing the liturgical stuff were exactly were similar to same class, same people who wrote the erotic and the wine stuff. Exactly the same.
Yeah, absolutely right. So there's an interesting tendency that that when I ask people this question, people say, well, one group are obviously very secular people, and one group are obviously very pious and religious people. And as it turns out, that the poetry I read to you tonight were written by two poets, and exactly the same poets were writing the erotic, homoerotic stuff, and they were writing the liturgical stuff as well. That's the thing that is most mind-blowing about this. Because I can tell you, I don't know of too many rabbis today in the Jewish world who are closet eroticists, right? They're doing all of their rabbinic stuff, but unless they're writing pseudonyms and they've got whatever, I don't think they are writing about the other thing. And this is what, to me, is probably one of the most intriguing and amazing aspects of this period of Jewish history. It's relatively short. It's relatively short. We're talking a period of about a window of perhaps about 200 and 250 years, but it takes me to the final aspect of our discussion, at least for the poetry. We'll go on to talk about other things, and that is living in two worlds. And since you have quite correctly identified that, Serge, why don't you unmute and read it for us. Just a minute. No, that's it. Go in. That's it.
Living in two worlds. Whilst our discussion has focused on the secular Hebrew poetry of Muslim Spain, it is equally important to recognise that the creators of this poetry borrowed elements from Arabic poetry for use in the synagogue as well. Jews continued to compose religious poetry for the synagogue which also employed biblical Hebrew and Arabic meter and borrowed themes from Islamic devotional thought. Thus, the very same Judah Halevi and Moses ibn Ezra, who wrote secular poetry, which celebrated wine, drinking, and erotic love, also wrote some of the most inspired liturgical poetry, which found its way into the Jewish prayer book and still continues to be recited on Yom Kippur, the most sacred day of the Jewish calendar. What is therefore particularly interesting and intriguing about the Hebrew poetry and poets of Muslim Spain is that they point to an early pre-modern Jewish community, albeit the elite of that community that was to straddle two worlds. Whilst living within its own social framework, this community was more influenced by the surrounding culture than any previously rabbinically regulated Jewish society in the diaspora. These wealthy Jews had a thorough grounding in Arabic language and literature. They participated in a variety of professions and occupied public positions of responsibility, whilst remaining pious, learned, and loyal to their Jewish cultural patrimony, yet not without some reservations. Can I just say, I think the surprising thing about this isn't that they one and the same, but that they didn't hide it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a surprising thing, was that they were accepted in both worlds quite openly.
Yeah. So that's what I think makes this community so fascinating, because really, I mean, as much as in the Baghdadian community of the Middle East, Jews were, for example, influenced by Arabic traditions. For example, I mentioned before that philosophy re-emerges in a certain sense in the community of Baghdad, but it's of a very different type. The philosophy of Sa'adja Gaon, who lived in Baghdad, was essentially a philosophy which did not value philosophy as an end in itself. Rather, it used philosophy to prove the truth of revealed religion. Philosophy was simply a tool, if you know what I mean. When you come to Maimonides, for example, who gets influenced by a totally different school of Islamic philosophy. The school of philosophy of Sa'adja Gaon is called the school of Kalam. It was a particular approach. The school of that Maimonides was influenced by, which was the school of Averroes, one of the people we talked about earlier, was the school of Falasifa. Listen to it, Falasifa, philosophy. And what you did there is you valued Greek philosophy as an end in itself, but obviously you had to integrate it into the monotheistic system of Islam and of Judaism. Now, the hard work of that was done by the Arabs. Maimonides basically was reading not Aristotle in the original, he was reading Aristotle in the Greco-Arabic version. And he sort of came to Aristotle through that. So that, that really, is the amazing thing, that people, that they lived thoroughly, and as I said, as Serge said, openly about this. That's what I find amazing about this particular society. Any other reactions or thoughts or comments? Yes, Vered.
I think it's really simple. The more decadent they were, the more repentance they needed. That's why there was liturgy. That's what I think.
Okay, that's a good way of thinking about it. Thank you for that, Vered. Yeah. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Okay. So let's move on to the next question. This is going to be the last thing I want to deal with tonight. You see, it's one thing to talk about, quote unquote, the golden age of Spanish Jewry, because it's sort of, when you put it like that, the golden age of Spanish Jewry, or the question I asked last week, what made the golden age golden? You begin with the presumption that there was a golden age. So if there was a golden age, what made it golden? But there's another question that we have to ask, and that is, well, how golden was it really? In other words, are we perhaps idealizing things? Are we exaggerating things, etc.? So what we're now going to deal with is what we might describe as a historiographical debate. The difference between, when we talk about studying history, you're basically studying the events of the past, what happened. right? It's not just descriptive, it's analytical and so on, but history is simply an attempt to reconstruct the past. That's what you're doing when you study history. Historiography goes behind the scenes, and it's a study of how historians choose to represent the past. Because remember, most of us, when we're studying history, are not doing so through the original primary sources. Most of us are not scholars, right? I'm a student and a teacher of history. I'm not a scholar. I stand on the shoulders of giants who do all the heavy lifting, and I've got to bring all this stuff together. I've got to read it and synthesize it and bring it all together. But historiography is a study of how people who go through all this stuff, how do they actually choose to represent the past, right? I mean, to give you a sort of an example that you'll easily relate to, you might be familiar with two Australian historians, Geoffrey Blainey and Manning Clark. If I were to take out in black references to Australia in their books, you would think you're reading about two entirely different countries. Because one comes from a particular, I mean, Manning Clark has got a distinctly sort of Marxist perspective in his writing. And Geoffrey Blainey is, of course, very famous for the glories of empire, right? Et cetera, et cetera. That's historiography. That's understanding how they choose to represent the historical narrative. So in a similar way, there's a whole historiographical debate about how you represent this period that we've been talking about. So it therefore comes down to a question of how golden was the Golden Age. And we're going to look at today 3 positions on this. This is what makes this, what I find actually a lot more interesting often is more than the events, is the debates about how to represent those events, which I think is really quite fascinating. Okay, so Mark, would you like to begin with the first position on this from Ellen Braunfeld, who wrote a look at Spain's Golden Age, encourages efforts towards future Muslim Jewish understanding. Okay, going on, the historic record.
The historic record of Muslim-Jewish cooperation is an extensive one. Indeed, when Jews were being harshly persecuted in Christian Europe, they often found a golden age in Muslim lands. In her book, The Ornament of the World, Professor Maria Rosa Menechal of Yale University explores a history of Jews under Muslim rule in Spain. Throughout most of the invigorated peninsula, Arabic was adopted as the ultimate in classiness and distinction by the communities of the other 2 faiths. The new Islamic polity not only allowed Jews and Christians to survive, but following Quranic mandate, by and large protected them, and both the Jewish and Christian communities in Andalus became thoroughly Arabized within relatively few years of Abdul Rahman's arrival in Cordoba. In principle, all Islamic polities were and are required by Quranic injunction to tolerate Christians and Jews living in their midst. But beyond that fundamental prescribed posture, Al-Andalus was, from these beginnings, a site of memorable and distinctive interfaith relations. Beginning with the 10th century, especially in the kingdom of Cordoba under the enlightened Umayyad caliphs Abd al-Rahman and his son al-Hakim, there appeared a galaxy of Jewish scholars, historians, philologists, grammarians, religious philosophers, mathematicians, astronomers, doctors, and poets. In general, the protected status of the Jews of Spain as dhimmi offered them several important freedoms. Jane Gerber notes that, compared to these essential privileges, disabilities involving social status and prestige were minor. In other words, the comparatively mild limitations of Islamic Spain held out great promise for Jewish settlement. Forever afterwards, the 10th and 11th centuries would be remembered by Jews as the nation's golden age, an epoch in which they enjoyed unusual political power and could participate actively in the dominant culture. For Jews and Muslims in particular, a review of history should be encouraging. On a recent visit to Andalusia, Cordoba, Seville, and Granada, among other places, this writer observed that many remaining reminders of the golden age of Muslim Jewish cooperation and amity. They serve to illustrate the lack of historic understanding of those who present the current impasse over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as the latest in a long history of strife and conflict. The real story is far different and far more hopeful. It may provide us with a genuine roadmap for the future.
Okay, so that's perspective one, and I think it's very clear where this guy's coming from, right? I mean, he clearly favours. He wants to. He sort of suggests that when it comes to representing this period of history, it's sort of almost like a utopian interfaith relations. It's that you get that sort of feel, and he quotes the author Maria Rosa Menechal, who is one of the leading historians of this particular approach. So she tends to, I mean, even her book, Ornament of the World, I mean, the title just gives it away, right? Etc. So she certainly, and it's a fantastic book, by the way, but you've just got to take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because there's no question that she tries to represent this whole story very much as a sort of a big kumbaya type of, Islamic Woodstock, right, shall we say, everyone coming together. But that is one approach, and you actually find a number of historians of this period who adopt that sort of particular approach. Now, there's going to be something that we're going to see, of course, because it's a debate like this, we're going to see something at the other end of the spectrum, right? And let's see what the other end of the spectrum is. So, Rosalind, do you want to pick this up for us? If you want to unmute and read from Andrew Boston. He wrote a thing called The Corrosive Hagiography of Muslim Spain. So beginning in her 2000 hagiography.
In her 2000 Hagiography of Muslim Spain, The Ornament of the World, Maria Rosa Menechal, Yale professor of Spanish and Portuguese, claimed, the new Islamic political entity not only allowed Jews and Christians to survive, but following Quranic mandate, by and large, protected them. I maintain that reiterating these sorts of historically inaccurate to wildly exaggerated claims regarding Muslim Spain abets the contemporary Islamic agenda.
Islamist, very important.
Islamist.
I'm going to come back to that later. Okay, yeah.
And retards the evolution of liberal, reformed Euro-Islam, fully compatible with post-Enlightenment Western values. Muslim Spain was a country of constant jihad, ruled under Maliki jurisdiction, which provided a severe oppressive interpretation of Islamic law. The indigenous Christians and Jews of Spain, conquered by the Arab-Muslim jihad wars, thus submitted to Islamic domination under a pact or dhimma, which imposed degrading and discriminatory regulations. In Granada, the Jewish viziers Samuel ibn Nagrela and his son Joseph, who protected a once flourishing Jewish community, were both assassinated between 1056 to 1066, followed by the annihilation of the Jewish population by the local Muslim community. The Muslim Berber Almohads in Spain and North Africa wreaked enormous destruction on both the Jewish and Christian populations. The eminent historian of Islam, Bernard Lewis, observed 35 years ago that 19th century pro-Islamic Jews promoted a utopian view of the egalitarian nature of Islamic rule, particularly in Muslim Spain. Not surprisingly, Muslims eventually also picked up on this romantic Jewish myth about Islam, which became a standard part of their own self-image. However, Lewis concludes, the golden age of equal rights was a myth, and belief in it was a result more than a cause of Jewish sympathy for Islam. An accurate assessment of interfaith relationships in Muslim Spain and the contemporary current responsible for obfuscating that history can be found in Richard Fletcher's very engaging Moorish Spain. In the second half of the 20th century, a new agent of obfuscation makes its appearance, The guilt of the liberal conscience, which sees the evils of colonialism assumed rather than demonstrated, foreshadowed in the Christian conquest of Al-Andalus. Stir the mix well together and issue it free to credulous academics and media persons throughout the Western world. Then pour it generously over the truth. In the cultural conditions that prevail in the West today, the past has to be marketed, and to be successfully marketed, it has to be attractively packaged. Medieval Spain, in a state of nature, lacks wide appeal. Self-indulgent fantasies of glamour do wonders for sharpening up its image. But Moorish Spain was not a tolerant and enlightened society, even in its most cultured epoch.
Super. Thanks, Rosalind. So, read that. If you did not know that they were both writing about Spain, you'd think they were talking about totally different periods of history, totally different places, etc. It's like, one represents it. Now, the important thing is, when Rosalind read Islamic, and I stopped and corrected Islamist. And what's important to understand here is that there is a very important distinction that has to be made between Islamic and Islamist. When we talk about Islamic, we're talking about the religion of Islam. When we're talking about Islamism, we are talking about the religion of Islam that has been corrupted by particular political ideologies, right? Whether they are left-wing, whether they're right-wing, but particular, often radical sort of ideology. So it's a corruption of the religion of Islam. What's going on in Bostom's case, and I'm going to come back to him a little bit later and say something more about him, because he's an absolutely fascinating individual, and you'll understand why I think that when I come back to him. But what I think is going on with him is he is conflating Islamism and Islam, right? In other words, this is a classic case, the way I see it, of reading history backwards. In other words, you begin with the present and you begin with the Islamist reality of today, highly radicalized Islam, etc., 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 and you project that backwards into the past. When that becomes your lens through which you interpret the past, you end up with this type of writing. On the other hand, when you're a Maria Rosa Menechal, who has a greater sympathy to Muslims and so on, when her lens are rose-colored, you end up with the ornament of the world, right? So you're getting two very, very different sort of approaches. And Boston, he's pretty vicious in his language. The way, he quotes Fletcher, but he's pretty much appropriating that language for himself. And he's sort of saying it's all part of this, kumbaya Western liberals who want to go soft on these Muslims. They're interested in just giving them good public relations. So how do you do that? You dress up this period as some wonderful interfaith utopia, etc., etc. So that's a second position. We'll come back to all this in a minute after we're finished. So we come to the third point of view, and this is, well, if we've got it two extremes, we're going to have someone who sits in the middle, obviously. So we're going to have a middle position. So let's have a look at that. Vivian, are you a reader? If you're not comfortable reading, just tell me. But if you are, then you okay?
Yep, that's
okay.
fine.
Go ahead.
Is it the new Muslim?
Yeah, the new Muslim anti-Semitism. Go ahead. Okay. Jewish-Muslim relations.
Jewish-Muslim relations are at a nadir today, but the mutual hatred and anti-Semitism on the Muslim side are relatively new phenomena, born of political rather than religious factors. When the Islamic caliphs ruled large swathes of Asia and Africa, their Jewish subjects enjoyed a protected status, their brethren in Christian Europe, victims of anti-Semitism, never thought possible. Today, Muslim apologists have distorted this age of coexistence. They appropriate an old Jewish myth about an interfaith utopia in the Middle Ages and blamed the Jews and Zionism for destroying the traditional harmony between the two peoples. In response, there is a new Jewish counter-myth that claims that Islam has persecuted Jews from its origins and that anti-Semitism is endemic in the religion.
Okay, in brackets, by the way, I've just, for those of you who want to follow up on this whole, because it's fascinating to read about, but on the way in which the whole Golden Age story in Spain has been totally politicized by, on the one hand, pro-Arabs, and on the other hand, deeply invested Zionists, both politicizing this story. There's a great article that you can read, and I've given you the link to that. But going on, the historic plight.
The historic plight of Oriental Jewry falls somewhere between these two extremes. To discover it, one must move past the layers of propaganda and mutual recriminations that have obscured our view of history. First of all, however, let us not make the mistake of thinking that Jews lived in the Middle Ages as the equal of Muslims. They were second-class citizens at best. They were classed along with other religious minorities as unbelievers who did not recognize the prophethood of Muhammad and the truth of the Quran. But this kind of unbelief was not as threatening to Islam as Jewish unbelief was to Christians. For unbelief in Christianity means rejection of Jesus as Messiah and as God, a greater affront to the dominant faith than Jewish unbelief was to Islam, because it challenged the theological basis of the whole religion. Moreover, restrictions on Jewish and Christian life were intended not so much to exclude them from society as they were meant to reinforce the necessary hierarchical distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims within a single social order. Non-Muslims were to remain in their place, avoiding any act, particularly any religious act, that might challenge the superior rank of Muslims or of Islam. Non-Muslims, however, occupied a definite rank in Islamic society, a low rank, but a rank nevertheless. The flip side of the discriminatory regulations imposed upon Jews is that they, as well as Christians, were a protected people, al-dima or dimes in Arabic, who enjoyed security of life and property, religious freedom, freedom from forced conversion, communal autonomy, and equality in the marketplace. For all its religious exclusivity and hostility towards the Jews expressed in the Quran and in other Islamic literature, Islam contains a nucleus of pluralism that gave the Jews in Muslim lands greater security than Jews had in Christian Europe. For other important reasons too, Jews in the Islamic orbit were spared the damaging stigma of otherness and anti-Semitism suffered by Jews in Europe. They were indigenous to the Near East, not immigrants as in many parts of the Christian West, and largely indistinguishable physically from their Arab Muslim neighbours. Moreover, Jews were one of two, and in some place three, non-Muslim minority religions, which also diffused the natural hostility towards the other. Again, to understand the relatively decent Jewish-Muslim relations in the medieval period, one needs to contrast them with the Christian world. In Christian society, hostility was focused on one evil, non-Christian group, the Jews, paving the way for what was to become understood as a religiously based complex of irrational, mythical, and stereotypical beliefs about the diabolical, malevolent, and all-powerful Jew. This kind of anti-Semitism did not exist in the medieval Muslim world. It did not make its appearance there until the 19th century, when it was fostered by European Christian missionaries living in the Middle East.
Okay, so what you have there with Mark Cohen, by the way, he has written a whole book on this subject. It's called Under Crescent and Cross, which is basically a comparative study of Jewish life under Christianity and Jewish life under Islam in the medieval period. So what I tried to selectively do in this article, because I had to edit it, was to sort of demonstrate that his whole approach is comparative. What he's suggesting, of course, is to ask the question, how golden was the golden age of Spain for Jews is like a bit of a stupid question, because you've got to add compared to who, right? It wasn't golden in and of itself, but compared to Jews living in the Christian world, you might say it was golden. But in its own right, it wasn't particularly so. Notice he talks about dhimmis as protected, but early on in the article, he talks about them also being second-class citizens, right? It's not a one street. So this is sort of the approach that he tends to adopt. And he also, in the article, the fuller version of the article, he goes into the contemporary politicization of it. So you see, when you're trying to get into political point scoring today, the way that works in the pro-Arabic world, the strongly pro-Arabic world, is to say, look, you know what? You just have to look back at the past, and we Muslims, we loved you Jews. We loved you like nobody else ever loved you. And you want the best example of that? Go to Muslim Spain, this beautiful, beautiful golden age. How did it all get messed up? When Jews started arriving in the Middle East and the onset of Zionism. So that's the lens. So you basically use that story of Muslim Spain as a way of sort of attacking Zionism as the cause for all this being undone. That's one spectrum. In the extreme Zionist version of this counter myth, they sort of say, that's just a lot of nonsense. What, you think Muslims were ever kind to anyone? Jews, Christians? I mean, Islam is an inherently hateful religion. And what you do in that process is you go back and cherry pick the Quran, because there's plenty of nasty things that in the Quran about Jews and Christians. By the way, as there are in the Bible about non-Hebrews, and as there are in traditional Jewish sources about non-Jews. So you can cherry pick your way through any tradition to sort of do that. So in the extreme sort of Zionist apologetic, it says, you know what? There's no golden age, never was. The only reason people talk about the golden age is because they're just wanting to tell us that it all got messed up when we Zionists came along. So that's the problem. The problem is that, and I made a point about this, I think, in my opening class. You've got to distinguish between history and advocacy. When you are engaged in the game of advocacy, the rule of thumb is don't let the facts get in the way of telling a good story. I mean, and by the way, it's fair enough, because that's what you're doing. You're advocating a position. I mean, if I was engaged in a discussion with someone and my goal was to advocate strongly for a position, I mean, I would bullshit my way through the whole argument, particularly if I knew the other person didn't have a clue about anything, right? On the other hand, if I'm teaching history, I've got to be very wary about the notion of advocacy. And that's where I say you've got to be very careful about not conflating Islam and Islamism. If you look at Islam through the lens of Islamism, through the politicized version of Islam, you end up with the corruption of Islam and the whole of the history that went with it. So this is sort of very important. So let me just open it up. We've looked at 3 points of view. How do these things sit with you? I mean, you know, if you're a rabid Islamist, by all means. If you're a kumbayarist, by all means, whatever. You know, yeah, we're on Zoom, so nobody can actually go and stab you or throttle you. So yes, David.
We spent most of today discussing how the Jews and Muslims philosophize together and learn from each other. And okay, I'm saying it's not a golden age, but the fact that they could actually sit down and talk to each other and learn from each other. And then Maimonides himself, he wasn't in Europe. He was, you know, was in the Middle East. So, you know, there was interaction that certainly wouldn't take place today.
Yeah. So that's important. But let's be clear about one thing. We're talking about an elite. So when we're talking about this meeting of minds and coming together, we're elite. But that very same Jewish elite might very well have experienced a form of discrimination as well, because they were dhimmis. There were certain things that they might not have been able to do, but Cohen's argument is that however bad that might have been, it was nowhere near as bad as it would have been if they were living in the Christian world, with all the blood libels and all of that, et cetera, and so on and so on. So you're right, but we've got to always be very careful to think it's an elite, and we've got to qualify it even at that level. By the way, a point that Mark Cohen makes in his book, and it's a very important observation, is that when you read Islamic sources, both the Quran and what they call the Hadith, which is their oral tradition, like our Torah Sheba'al Peh, what you have to always be aware of is that the law on the books was often a lot harsher than what was actually carried out in practice. In other words, often pragmatism was at play, and it depended on historical and social circumstances. When Islamic powers were under threat and under pressure, what do? Everyone does it. It goes on in the world today. You look for a scapegoat, right? You look for a scapegoat. It happens all over the place in the whole of the world. And so when a scapegoat was needed, Jews tended to suffer the impact of dhimmitude with far greater severity than when they had no reason to do that. So you need to contextualize. That's what history is about. So thanks, David. So any other reactions, thoughts? Yeah, Moshe.
The response of the people who did come from Sfard, the Jews, was that it was for them a golden age, and that they carry that tradition. So that's got to tell you something. Or the descendants that experienced that have a longing for it, and you go, idealized or not, there is something that was positive for them in it.
Absolutely.
That remains as an important piece.
And I'll use the contrast. My late mother, if she ever spoke about, she was born in Ukraine, or sometimes it was Poland, it was right on the border. If she ever spoke about Poles on Ukraine, it was followed by an absolute big spit on the ground. Pooh, Poles, that sort of thing. I have yet to come across Jews who have come from the Spanish position, real Sephardic Jews, who actually will accompany talking about, with all the Inquisition and all of that, in that same way. In fact, they have a pride about their Sephardic heritage, which Polish Jews don't necessarily have. They have a pride about the Alter Heim, as I talked about at the beginning, the old home, but it's not because it was Poland. So there's a sense of that. And you're right, whether it's idealized or not, there's something there that they carry that tradition with them. Okay. Any other reactions to what we've read, these three different positions? Okay, so let's finish. Moshe's in fact provided me with a segue into the final two poems that I want to share with you. Because he sort of said, the fact that, Jews of Sephardic descent still carry this sort of image of this wonderful life that their ancient ancestors would have had in Spain. So let's hear directly from Jews who lived in Spain. So far, we've been reading 20th, 21st century historians, and let's hear about these Jews from Spain. But before I get there, let me just share with you something about Andrew Bostom that I have in mind. This guy's fascinating. This is the guy who wrote the second piece, right? Now, Andrew Bostom is actually a professor of medicine. He's a retired professor of medicine, originally from Brown University. Brown University is one of the Ivy League universities in the United States, right? So he wrote two books. One of them was called The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, and the other one was called The Legacy of Jihad, Legacy of Islamic Holy War. A professor of medicine who wrote two substantial books. They are each of them about this thick. They run into hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. The thing about these books is this, however, half of the books contain documents that come from the classical Arabic world. Now, a lot of those documents he had access to in translation. That wasn't a problem. But a lot of the documents were only available in classical Arabic. And this guy, a professor of medicine, taught himself classical Arabic to an ability, to a level where he could actually translate difficult classical Arabic texts, right? Muslim texts, right? So obviously the guy's obsessed. He's totally obsessed with this. And I just want to share with you, because when I came across this guy for the first time, I was teaching at Monash University, and somebody once said to him, "Have you ever heard of Andrew Bostom?" You know, really, really great stuff. I mean, obviously they came from the sort of Islamist type of perspective. I said, "Oh, you've got to read this guy. He's fantastic." Never heard of him. So I look him up and I see 2 books on Amazon. They're in the Monash library, and I go across and I'm just like amazed. And I read that about him, that he's actually taught himself to translate these documents. So he was interviewed a number of years ago, and I just want to share with you something, because it gives you an insight into what drives this guy, what motivates this guy, and possibly explains why he wrote in the way that he wrote when we wrote about this piece. So this interview it's called Islam and Anti-Semitism, an interview with Dr. Andrew Bostom. And the interviewer makes the following observation. He asks the question: how does a medical doctor come to produce books on Islam, jihad, and anti-Semitism? He wants to know what is actually driving you. So in answer to that, Bostom makes the following, sorry, I've just lost it. Here we go. It makes the following observation. Bostom says it's pretty straightforward. The stimulus was 9/11. Until then, I was an average citizen trying to keep abreast of world events. I'm not particularly religious as a Jew, though I certainly support the state of Israel. But I grew up in New York, living in Queens most of our life. I went to medical school in Brooklyn. My wife and I still have family in New York City. So the day of 9/11 itself was traumatic, trying to make sure that everyone was okay. And I was alarmed at the stories that started to appear in the New York Times and other New York area newspapers about an Egyptian imam who was preaching at a large mosque in Manhattan and spreading conspiracy theories about Jews leaving the World Trade Center in advance of the attacks due to their prior knowledge. So I started reading independently. Now, what Bostom goes on to do in the interview is he starts citing the various things that he read. The problem is that almost everything that he reads represent apologists for the Islamist agenda, right? In other words, the anti-Islamist. In other words, these are people say he's like traumatized by 9/11. It's and he's trying to explain this, and he sort of starts reading stuff that leads him to a particular type of direction, an Islamist type of thing. And this is an example of history being written backwards. He goes back. And when he starts reading these sources, he's reading them through a particular lens of the present. So what he's actually doing is advocacy. When I taught history at Monash University, I was absolutely amazed with this guy. And I actually, because I'm not a scholar of this period in a real sense, I actually wrote to Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis, who was still alive at that time. The guy was, by the way, folks, 93 years old and still working at Princeton, right? He's like he was regarded as the leading scholar of Jews in Islam. And I said, look, can you just tell me about this guy, Bostom? I noticed he's not referenced in anything you write. I said, a lot of people I'm reading, and his answer basically was this. He said, what he has done for the scholarly non-Arabic speaking world is a great service. He's translated texts that previously were not accessible. However, his analysis of the text is highly suspect. That's the issue, that's the problem. So I ended up using Bostom, but as an example of when you study history, how you have to be careful about the slippery slope and not to avoid that. Anyway, let us hear finally from 2 Jews in Muslim Spain. These guys were living in the midst of this golden age. One of them was Yehuda Halevi. He was one of the poets who spoke about all this, you know, drinking and love poetry and so on and so on. So let's read from Halevi. He writes a poem which is called My Heart is in the East. My heart is in the East, and I am at the edge of the West. That is, I'm sitting here in Spain. So how can I taste what I eat? How can I enjoy it? How can I fulfill my vows and my pledges while Zion is in the domain of Edom, that is Christianity, and I am living in the bonds of Arabia under Muslim rule? It would be easy for me to leave behind all of the good things of Spain, and it would be glorious to see the dust of the ruined shrine. So one voice from that golden age. The other one is Danash Ben Labrat. Danash Ben Labrat, you remember, was the poet who was brought over from North Africa to start this whole poetic tradition. And basically you have to read this poem as a sort of a dialogue between the poet being invited to drink and responding to the inviter. So he said to me, he invited me, he said, do not sleep, drink old wine amidst myrrh, lilies, henna, aloe, in an orchard of pomegranates, palms and vines, full of pleasant plants and tamarisks, to the hum of fountains and the throb of lutes, to the sound of singers, flutes and lyres. There every tree is tall, branches are fair with fruit, and winged birds of every kind sing among the leaves. The doves moan melodiously, and the turtle doves reply, cooing like reed pipes. There we shall drink amongst flower beds, fenced in by lilies, putting sorrow to rout with songs of praise. We shall eat sweets as we drink by the bowlful. We will act like giants, drinking out of huge goblets. And in the mornings, I will arise to slaughter fat choice bulls, rams and calves. We will anoint ourselves with fragrant oil and burn aloe incense. Oh, before doom overtakes us, let us enjoy ourselves in peace, loathed and abhorred, and less than nothing. So the poet is being invited to take part in this thoroughly hedonistic way of life, which he himself has probably experienced and written about. So what does the poet say to the inviter? He says, I reproached him and I said, silence, how dare you, when the holy house, the footstool of God, is in the hands of the Gentiles. You have spoken foolishly, you have chosen sloth, you have uttered nonsense like the mockers and the fools. You have forsaken the study of supreme God's law. And even as you rejoice, jackals run wild in Zion. So how could we drink wine? How even raise our eyes when we are loathed and abhorred and less than nothing? Now let's understand, of course, that Danash Labrat is not writing about two different people. That's him. This is going on in his head. On the one hand, the poet who is longing for this wonderful, wonderful hedonistic way of life has a guilty conscience about the whole thing. He's realizing that life is not as wonderful as one would think it is. And Halevi says, living in this Mr. Scholar, I'd be prepared to give it all up to see the dust of the ruined shrine. So in a certain sense, I think what I want to say here, and I'll finish off here, is that hearing from the original voices of Jews from this period brings us down to a certain sense of reality. On the one hand, they are clearly acknowledging that life was quote unquote wonderful. Well, as wonderful as it could be for a dhimmi, right, etc. But on the other hand, they're saying, you know what? I'd give it all away if I could be there in the midst of the ruined temple, etc. So I think that grounds us in that sort of reality. And for me, that sort of, if anything, leads me more towards Mark Cohen's position, which I think in modern historiographical sorts of terms, I think is emulating exactly that type of perspective. Right? That's the point of view. Okay, folks, so we have finished tonight Jews under Muslim rule. What we're going to start next week is the process of Christians reconquering Spain. And with the Christian reconquest of Spain, we're going to enter the next part of our story, which of course is going to be Jews in Spain under Christian rule. All right, so that's where we are heading to over the next few weeks. So thank you for your attention. Have a wonderful Pesach. You know, well, how can you say enjoy Pesach? I mean, it's like slavery, you know, it's like experiencing slavery before the Seder night. But anyway, enjoy the Seders and with your families and whatever, and we will see you next Monday. So even though it is Chol HaMoed, right? But not next Tuesday, sorry. No.
No, you're a week ahead of yourself, Paul.
Okay, so we're not. Okay, so take that back. I don't wish you a happy Pesach yet. I will do so again next week. So we'll meet again next week. But I'm giving you advance notice that the week after we will continue during Chol HaMoed Pesach. Okay. All right. Okay.
Thank you very
All
much.
the best.
Thanks very
Thanks,
much.
Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.